Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm an OpenSciEd teacher and facilitator, and today we get to dig into Lesson 8 where we figure out which condition is making McKenna feel so sick. But that also leaves us with more questions we want to explore about her symptoms as well as the human body system. Let's take a minute and remember how we got here. During the last lesson, we eliminated 2 of the 5 possible conditions that could be causing McKenna to feel so sick, and we argued from evidence why these 2 conditions couldn't be what's making her ill. We then decided we needed some more information because during the assessment task, we noticed some words like villi that we didn't have answers to. So this leads us to wonder, what does the surface of McKenna's small intestine look like up close compared with a healthy one? Because we got some of that information out of the assessment. Let's take a peek at the lesson at a glance. This is an investigation lesson. It should take about 2 days to complete. There are about 20 minutes of material preparation in advance. It is not a hands-on investigation, but your students will need devices during this lesson. Also, there are no additional related videos that you need to watch in advance. In this 2-day lesson, you'll find that there are 2 major sense-making sections that your students will get to dig into. The first one starts by focusing in on the organization of the human body, specifically learning that the body is organized from largest to smallest, being systems, all the way down to cells, and that villi are a small cell-based structure. This then leads us into our second sense-making section of the lesson, which starts at the end of day 1 and carries over into day 2. Students will use a simulation to investigate the role of villi and determine that they are critical for the absorption of food. But this brings us to our last sense-making section, and it helps us to revisit the task from Lesson 7. Here we have a new understanding of villi and its structure and function, and we are able to apply this to McKenna's case. Here they see that McKenna's small intestine is lacking the folds of a healthy person and argue from evidence about which condition is actually making her feel so ill. Let's dig into some key moments throughout this lesson. One of the first key moments is found in part 4 of our lesson, which is about halfway through day 1. Here we use the hands-on simulation investigation to figure out the role and function of the villi. The main goal is to explore how the physical structure of the villi directly affect the absorption of the nutrients. We want students to see that if villi are healthy and tall, absorption is high. But if they are damaged or flat, that far less nutrients are able to be absorbed by the body. Students will be working in pairs to collect their data. Knowing your class, it may be helpful to chunk the directions for the simulation activity into smaller, more manageable steps, and you may also want to be prepared to model the graphing portion if that's necessary for your students. Since McKenna's small intestine appears flat, she's not able to absorb nutrients in the same way as a healthy person. This is a moment that also connects back to a prior lesson, being lesson 4, and explains why McKenna still had food in her waist, but a healthy person doesn't. And then this brings us to the end of day 1. Now we begin day 2 with part 5, where we just completed a consensus building discussion, and the students discussed their key findings from the simulation. Now, this key moment in part 6, students will update their 3-column progress tracker with all that they've just learned. This will become an artifact the students will be able to use when completing their argument task that they had started in Lesson 7. Students should be able to show their learning in the progress tracker in words or diagrams. Add scaffolds as necessary, such as partner work or group collaboration, to assist your students with identifying all the key information that they've figured out to date. The final key moment in this lesson happens in part 7 at the end of the lesson. Here, students will independently complete part 3 of the assessment task. In the teacher guide, there are suggestions for ways to support students in their writing, including things like sentence stems. Then, there's an opportunity for students to provide and receive peer feedback prior to turning in the assessment using an argument rubric. If you choose to do so, you can give your students the opportunity to revise their argument as well as complete the self-assessment rubric on how they feel they did when giving and receiving feedback. Even though it's not explicitly called out in the teacher edition, this is a great opportunity for you to revisit your classroom norms with your students. So where do we go from here? At this point, your students have realized they figured out a lot of new information and narrowed down the list of conditions to just one that could possibly be causing McKenna to feel so sick. But we've also now reached a point where we realized we can answer many of our initial questions on our driving question board. So we decide to revisit our driving question board and see what we feel confident about. However, at this point, we're also starting to pay attention to the questions that we can't quite answer yet, because these will become important in the next upcoming lessons. Let's look at some materials management and tips and tricks. In this lesson, you will want to make sure in advance that the simulation will work on student devices and prevent any firewall issues that might come up during class time. Also, you may wish to pre-read the directions for the simulation or chunk them as necessary to support your students with moving through the simulation. The key idea that they need to understand from the simulation is that when the villi are taller, they're able to absorb more nutrients into the bloodstream. As with Lesson 7, you may want to take the time to consider what scaffolds you will need to use during the completion of the assessment, and also determine when and how you would like your students to complete the peer feedback or self-assessment opportunity. It is up to you whether you would like to give feedback on Part 1 and Part 2 prior to your students completing Part 3, or if you would like to just give it back to them and have them reevaluate and move forward. There are a couple new word wall words to be added in this lesson. The first is the word villi, which is finger-like structures that line the small intestine. There's no words that we encounter, but we do reinforce some words from prior units, those being cells and tissues, if you've completed Unit 6.6. Posters should be available to your students, including the driving question board, as well as the student assessment task from Lesson 7. A new material that will be created during this lesson will be the system mapping chart, which maps out the human body system from system to cells. This will be a poster that you'll make and keep public. Material management includes chart paper, markers, student devices, and simulation handouts, the Part 3 student assessment, as well as access for all students to the driving question board. Thank you for digging into this lesson with me, and next we're going to take a step and look at what our students will be completing in Lesson 9.